When I came to UCLA as the dean of the Luskin School in January, I wanted to expand what was already a pretty successful lecture series, the Luskin Lecture, into a series of programs that did something more. And what we wanted to do in addition was to have an in-depth examination of the issues that the speaker was going to address. And what we really wanted to do, particularly today, was understand how a free press can cope with a world in which the leadership is trying to intimidate you. And so this is the theme of today's entire event and the theme of tonight's discussion. I have great respect for journalists, especially those who persevere and maintain their objectivity when they face pressure from those who wield power, especially in Washington. And Ray Suarez is one of those journalists. Now, I've known Ray for a number of years, and I've been interviewed by him at least twice. For those of you who have ever done press as an academic or as a political activist, you'll know that frequently you can sound smart or dumb depending on the quality of the questions that you are asked. And it turns out that a really bad interviewer can make you look like a blathering idiot, just simply because they ask questions that are so indecipherable and so difficult to understand that you end up spending time trying to rehabilitate the question rather than actually answer it. I can say that I've never had to do that with Ray Suarez. The quality of the questions always make me look smart, mercifully smarter than I actually am, which is a real effort on his part, and it worked out. So thank you for that, Ray. In our relationship, he's the journalist and I was the source, and he interviewed me about politics. And I learned that as a source, I could trust him. And by trust him, I mean he was prepared on the questions that he was going to ask me. In one particular instance, when I was resident in Washington, D.C. for a while, we did an interview in Stanford's Washington Center, and he came in and ostensibly, we were going to have a conversation in advance to make sure we were both on the same page before we started filming. And the camera crew was like, we need to start filming now because our conversation in advance was so comfortable and so on target that we were actually kind of covering the material that we wanted to cover in the interview, and we had to go back and redo some of the questions. Because Ray was prepared. Ray understood what he was asking questions about. So when Ray calls, I take the call. And I'm happy to do the interview. He's smart, he's funny, he's knowledgeable about the things I know about, and he's knowledgeable about lots of aspects of what's happening in the current environment. Ray was until recently the host of Al Jazeera America's daily news program, Inside Story. Previously, he was a correspondent and anchor at the NewsHour on PBS, and worked for the National Public Radio as a host. He is also an author and wrote the companion to the PBS documentary series Latino Americans. And he published an examination of the relationship between religion and electoral politics, The Holy Vote. In September, Ray will begin an appointment as the McCloy Visiting Professor of American Studies at Amherst College, but tonight, we are fortunate to have him here with us. So ladies and gentlemen, to deliver tonight's Luskin Lecture, please join me in welcoming Ray Suarez.
Let me begin by thanking Dean Segura for bringing me out to be with you all, and I'm glad for the opportunity to talk on this particular subject. When I chose the theme and the title, What an Enemy of the People Has to Do Now, I was being a little tongue-in-cheek. The new president had referred to reporters as enemies of the American people, a shocking thing to say, really. But like much of his vehemence, it only seemed tactical and ultimately toothless. Since then, the president has proposed rewriting libel laws, reopening a debate about the composition of the First Amendment. He's targeted reporters and targeted news organizations, and his press shop has welcomed into the White House entities that are anything but news organizations. We may, now that the conference is here, be someplace different. Just yesterday, the Republican candidate in the special congressional election in Montana, in response to questioning by a reporter from the Guardian newspaper, grabbed, choked, punched, and finally slammed the reporter to the ground. As news began to circulate of the physical attack on a reporter by a congressional candidate, Greg Gianforte's campaign released a statement knocking the reporter, Ben Jacobs, for the incident, bemoaning, quote, aggressive behavior from a liberal journalist in the news release, which contained the non-apology apology. Other news people who witnessed the confrontation backed up Ben Jacobs' version. The reporter filed a complaint with police. Candidate Gianforte has been charged with misdemeanor assault. The 3 largest newspapers in Montana have withdrawn their endorsements for the candidate. But this afternoon, NBC News is reporting that on the candidate's website, $100,000 in donations have come in since the attack. Election day is today in Montana, but the lion's share of the vote has already been cast. But think about where we are for a moment. Physical attacks on reporters asking questions. That's the kind of thing that happens in Moscow, not in Montana. But think also about how a story like this lives beyond the life of one man momentarily attacking another at a campaign headquarters. There will be many Americans repulsed by this story. There will be many Americans who will quietly conclude that Jacobs had it coming, that stepping up to people who want to be members of Congress and asking them inconvenient questions and continuing to ask them questions if they don't feel like answering is somehow untoward, a sign of how things have become unglued, gotten out of whack. Why didn't the reporter know his place? While we're at a perilous time in the history of the country and the world, respect for the news business keeps finding new lows. And instead of regarding Jacobs as a necessary, if occasionally irritating part of how you know the things you need to know, there are millions convinced that Ben Jacobs, me, thousands of others do not operate in the public interest, but work for ourselves to advance only our own interests. And we are enemies of the truth rather than devoted to it. I was on Fox News Channel this past Sunday morning talking about the use of anonymous sources in news stories. I explained that the reporters from the New York Times and the Washington Post, who had in recent weeks been breaking stories of critical importance, always try as a first choice to get their sources on the record, to get their sources to speak with attribution, and that it was more of an art rather than a science to determine when the importance of a story rises to a level that lifts the necessity of publishing beyond the necessity of named sources. None of this was very revolutionary. It was more explanatory, expository, but none of it was, trotting on new territory. Fox put my Twitter handle on the screen, and the host of the program, Howard Kurtz, used my handle when tweeting out a preview of the program. So when I got back in the town car that they send for you to go be on Fox, and I'm heading back home, and I take out my phone and, just out of curiosity, look at Twitter, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of angry tweets from people who, let's say, don't normally follow me. One said, "You think you can insult 63 million people and get away with it? Sorry, we're fed up with this. Back off with the unsourced articles." One wrote, "This crap had best stop, or you asses are promoting a civil war. Your attack is not on Trump. it's on us. Another chimed in, Trump got both electoral and popular vote wins. Trump will win in a landslide in 2020. Now, it was a bit of a ride still left to go, and that one kind of intrigued me. So I replied, yes, he won the Electoral College by a solid margin. Popular win? Nonsensical idea. 2020? I guess we'll see. He is already running. To which the woman who identified herself on her Twitter main page as a Trump supporter happily watching the swamp drained replied, bullcrap. Trump won the popular and electoral votes. No one will tell me different. To all my friends who yell at me and ask, why do you engage with these people? I must apologize, but I tweeted back, no one will tell you different? A remarkable thing to say. To which Jax replied, remarkable? It's the truth. I answered, all I've got is vote counts from the secretaries of state. You have your imagination. You're right, no contest, uncle. And Jax replied, no, you don't. All lies. I know Trump got the popular vote. Go argue with someone else, 'cause I don't care. Now, I think it's a small but revealing exchange. The truth is under tremendous stress in the United States. Observable, countable, measurable, testable truth now has to fight on an even playing field with your feelings. And at the risk of pointing out the obvious, your feelings don't carry nearly the burden of evidence that the truth does. For my Twitter correspondent, nothing I said, no proof I brought to bear in 140 characters, no Republican Trump-supporting Secretary of State insisting his or her state's vote count was legit and unsullied will convince her. We live in an age where the discourse and its rules of engagement were tailor-made for my correspondent, Jax. For decades, we've been laying the groundwork for this moment. It didn't arise like crocuses in the front lawn. It's a time in which fact becomes just one more point of view that must contend with others for the love and allegiance of a continent-sized country of 325 million people. As we heard in the earlier panel today, we now live in an information ecosystem where it's possible to exist in a customizable information universe, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, where your confirmation bias is your ticket to a world where you are never disagreed with. Elected officials who watched the Affordable Care Act passed and implemented over their vehement objections did not quietly fold and move on to the next political battle. They fought a 7-year war to undermine the actual legislative and financial mechanisms that put the act into place. They cheered and encouraged outside bodies that launched legal test cases to climb the appellate ladder, gunning for one or more parts of the machinery that made the law workable. And very importantly, they worked hard to obscure public understanding of what the law did and didn't do and undermine public confidence in its operation. And now, with control of the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, with the help of another safe vote on the Supreme Court, the ACA's political opponents are now finally able to deal the death blow to President Obama's signature domestic policy initiative. They're pretty close to doing it. But what to put in its place? People on all sides of the debate understood very well that the longer millions of people got subsidies to pay the insurance bill, had lifetime caps for expensive-to-treat conditions removed, and pre-existing conditions erased as a reason to be denied insurance, the longer that went on, the more they would like it. So they promised during the campaign to continue to strive for repeal, and many candidates said, you could have the parts that people really like. Keeping adult children on your plan until their 26th birthday, making it easier to move from one provider to the next, not allowing premiums to spiral out of sight as you got older. And they wouldn't have to put up with the parts they didn't like. The mandate, the taxes on high-cost plans, the narrowing choices of coverage we saw in some markets. It was like a policy promise that you could eat cake and ice cream every day and not gain weight. Anyone who had covered the healthcare battles of the last 25 years in Washington for a day knew that the stuff people didn't like paid for the stuff that they did like. Except we couldn't get elected officials to admit that. They wouldn't. So the new administration came to Washington, and the AHCA, the American Health Care Act, was passed by the House, and now everything seems to have slowed down. The dreaded Congressional Budget Office score has arrived, and as promised, tens of millions of people, it is predicted, won't have insurance who had it under the Affordable Care Act. Now, having the courage of your convictions, especially after 7 years of repeal votes, means you go out, own that, explain why the new law is better, and try to win the battle of ideas. Not having the courage of your convictions means you knock the Congressional Budget Office. Deny that Medicaid is being cut by hundreds of billions of dollars when it's in the plain language of the bill. But if you're an average individual American, less sure now, after a 30-year war on the press, of who's telling the truth, when, why, when you're an American who's just been told diametrically opposite things by two different authority figures who both insist they're the ones telling the truth, and you increasingly loathe the news business that's trying to help you sort it out, well, it's tough knowing how to proceed. How do you handle the promises to cut support for the poor, cut income taxes, spend more on the military, and balance the budget? Proposals that look hard to believe based on the president's budget plan. Do you continue to believe the president because you like him, or hold your nose and listen to reporters who are trying to play a key educative role? So you at least enter the debate armed with reality, even though you don't like reporters. Or take illegal immigration. Right now, there are an estimated 11.5 million people who aren't legally permitted to live and work in the country, living and working here. Take the undocumented populations of just 4 places. Just 4 places. In descending size of unauthorized population, New York, LA, Miami, Chicago. And you've accounted just in those 4 cities for 1/4 of the illegally resident population in the whole damn country. Just those 4 places. The whole country. But during the last year and a half of active campaigning and now governing by Donald Trump, did the candidate, the president-elect, or the president note that 1 million illegally resident Mexicans have gone back to Mexico since 2007? That there are fewer illegal immigrants in the United States than there were during the Bush years? That the United States deported 1,160,000 people during the second Obama term alone? That of the 5.5 million or so Mexicans living illegally in the United States, more than 3/4 have lived in the country more than 10 years. The average length of residence is 12.7 years. Ever hear that mentioned during the campaign? No. I watched the Trump campaign very closely as it marched toward its first test in the Iowa caucuses, watched as it refined its signature themes and proposals. At nearly every stop, the candidate laid out several main points, often as not to big cheers from rapturous crowds. Number one, that border security was a joke, that we, quote, don't even have a border, that people are, quote, pouring across the border. Two, that one way to stop the flow was to seal off the southern border of the United States. Three, that crime in America's metropolitan areas is driven by the presence of undocumented people. And four, that just sending the criminal population among the illegally resident population would mean getting 2 to 3 million people out of the country. These ideas are widely believed, and thanks to the president, more widely believed than they were before he began the campaign. Advocates and activists on both sides of the immigration question agree. Illegal immigration in the United States is being driven by visa overstays, not by border crossers. The Center for Migration Studies, which does not advocate a path to citizenship or even access to legal residence for the undocumented, points out that since 2007, 600,000 more people overstayed than crossed the border. 2 of 3 undocumented in the country in 2014 were overstays, not border crossers. If you know that, if you know that a large percentage of the undocumented entered the country legally and then did not leave when they were supposed to, would you still want to spend $25 billion on a wall? These shared notions, in absolute contradiction to reporting of the facts, create the basis for developing public policy. The president frequently referred to Kate Steinle as he campaigned across the country. You've heard the story, terrible, tragic killing of a young woman in the Bay Area by a man who wasn't supposed to be in the country, in fact, had been deported several times and kept finding his way back to California by eluding law enforcement. The president proposed a new Victims of Immigrant Crime Engagement Office, or VOICE, to work with families victimized by undocumented criminals. During his speech to a joint session of Congress, he said, "I've ordered the Department of Homeland Security to create an office to serve American victims. We are providing a voice to those who've been ignored by our media and silenced by special interests." That's kind of a threefer, since it's meant to heighten the concern about immigrant criminals, implies they are numerous, and then takes a shot at the news business, for good measure, by hinting that we know all these stories but are purposely not reporting them. If you take a look at crime statistics for the 30 years from 1980 to 2010, which includes the years when the undocumented population was at its highest among high crime age men, 18 to 49, immigrants were 1/2 to 1/5 as likely to be incarcerated as those born in the United States. Across all ages and sexes, 7% of the nation's population is made up of non-citizens, and 5% of the inmates in state and federal prisons are non-citizens. U.S.-born men without a high school diploma have a much higher rate of incarceration than immigrant men, illegally and legally resident. If you know that, will the president's particular singling out of immigrant crime for attention have as high an impact? I mention all this not as a way to argue with the president over immigration and immigration reform, but more as an illustration of the centrality of facts in public debate. Your dreams, your feelings, your impressions, your sentiments, your anger are all potent drivers of what politicians decide to do. Elected officials are particularly attuned to public sentiment. But what if the public believes things that just ain't so? What's the responsibility of a leader then? Should he or she simply affirm the things you believe that aren't true, shape policies around your misperceptions of the world, or try to persuade you of the truth? If you wanted to cut off the flow of illegal immigrants to the United States, given the ratio of overstays to border crossers, would you put more emphasis on making sure that people with visas go home, or put more emphasis on building a big, beautiful wall? What's the motivation for trying to depict an army of agricultural workers, house painters, home care workers, hotel chambermaids, busboys, kitchen workers as a dangerous element inside the United States? Any claim, explicit or implicit, that the U.S. could lower the crime rate by targeting criminal aliens or ramping up deportations would appear to be fundamentally misplaced. And by what factual analysis or moral reasoning would we exclude a totally innocent person from coming to the country who's been escaping bombs dropped on civilian populations by Syrian President Assad's forces because other Syrians are bad people? What is the moral reasoning that undergirds that? Yet the fear of Middle Eastern refugees is palpable in the country. Here we are. If you desire to know and understand the truth, if you really are trying to build a coherent version that you can live with of the world around you in order to do the work of a citizen, you have, as near as the closest keyboard, more available knowledge about more things than has ever been available to a human being in the history of the world. Almost instantly. But along with the good stuff, there's a lot of junk. There's adulterated product. The individual confronting the information marketplace is not helpless, but boy, is he or she outgunned, outmanned, outspent. It is an unequal struggle from the start. There are people willing to lie to you, who are prepared to spend mountains of money to get their way, while those of us on the other side of the battle are spending pennies in comparison to stand up for the idea that we need to head into the battle to shape public opinion, public policy, establish public priorities, achieve some common wisdom on how we want to live, beginning with the truth. I don't want to make it sound easier than it is. No less a prominent former elected official than the one-time Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, got into a fascinating back and forth with the CNN anchor over crime statistics. He said, "The average American does not think crime is down, does not think they are safer." The reporter, Alison Camerata, answered, "But we are safer, and it is down." To which Gingrich replied, "No, liberals may have a whole set of statistics that prove they are right, but it's not where human beings are. What I said is equally true. People feel more threatened." Gingrich concluded, and he waved a sort of dismissive arm, "I'll go with how people feel, and I'll let you go with the theoreticians." We weren't talking about quarks or black holes. We were talking about how many people get robbed or raped or killed in the United States, something that crazy liberal outfit, the FBI, has been counting for decades. It's not a theory from a theoretician that violent crime is down. It's down over the past 5 years, and it's down substantially over the last 10, 20, and 30 years. I will plead guilty to being an old-fashioned guy when it comes to this stuff. I think the fact that the streets of America are remarkably safer than they were is a triumph. It's a triumph and something we should be proud of, not satisfied with. Of course, we should aim for a day when the country is safer still. But what is the responsibility of a leader What is the responsibility of a person entrusted with the profound task of shaping a shared response to violent crime? Is it to reinforce untruth when it suits a personal need? Is it to push back against even a strongly held, widely believed untruth, even when it makes coming to common wisdom harder, because simple falsehood is so much more appealing than confusing fact? New York, my hometown, is the safest big city in America and has been for years, and is getting safer still, year by year. If you still want to convince people that America's cities are dangerous hellholes, you wouldn't spend too much time trying to figure out what worked in New York, why it's so safe, and how to reproduce that success in cities where violent crime remains a persistent problem. You'll go with how the people feel rather than with the theoreticians. The move to unhook our decision-making from what is real to how we feel is something that should disturb and challenge every citizen. Would it surprise you to find out that Little Rock, Arkansas, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Birmingham, Alabama all have much higher rates of violent crime than New York? Many of you would be surprised. But that only magnifies the need for a news business that's willing to continue to take the risk of telling you things you don't know, even when it commonly contradicts your most fondly held ideas, especially when it pushes back on the things politicians say that are designed to reinforce stereotypes, pander to prejudgment, provide a comforting view of an uncomfortable world by fitting easily into the confines of what you already believe. The job of telling the truth turns out to be different from the job of getting elected. The stunningly low credibility ratings for our most important institutions should give everyone who cares about the future of the country pause. But imagine an entire society that can't really sort out what to believe or who to believe. There are no death panels. Global warming is not a Chinese conspiracy. White murder victims are not killed almost exclusively by non-white assailants. Americans don't pay the highest taxes on earth. That's not liberal. That's not conservative. It just is. And it pleases me no end to be able to say this on a college campus, on a public research university campus, because the public system has created and still has the potential to create the freest, richest, smartest citizenry on earth. The existence of this place is an antidote to the cynicism about education and its purposes, an antidote to the widespread loss of faith in expertise, an antidote to the idea that there can be both facts and alternative facts. For a country with the potential for being so smart, our politics have become so dumb. We have a politics that right now does not seem equal to the task of helping us solve our most challenging problems. As someone who grew up in the 60s and 70s, it is shocking for me to watch the resurgence of heroin addiction and watch the ravages of early death it's bringing to communities across the country. We, as a people, have achieved stunning things in the design and production of goods. And as our factories pour out these goods, more and more of our people have become part of a permanent contingent labor force, scrambling to provide for themselves and their families, finding themselves discouraged, left behind, locked out of the wealth and comfort taken as a matter of birthright by millions of their fellow citizens. But if you think about the millions who are disappointed and want answers, it is easier to blame Mexicans in our midst. It is easier to blame Chinese 10,000 miles away, or the robots who replaced an estimated 670,000 manufacturing workers in the U.S. between 1990 and 2007. I think the Mexicans and the Chinese are catnip, and nobody's blaming the robots. If you want to blame somebody for the tremendous offshoring of jobs to other places in the world, it's easier to blame Washington politicians who already have extremely low credibility ratings. Or would you rather blame the people who ran the industries, to whom workers offered their loyalty, labor, and work lives? We've pioneered treatments for some of humankind's most deadly diseases, inventing the machines and the compounds that bring cures and unlock the most ferociously guarded secrets of genetic code and deeply embedded threats to health. And at the same time, we're still in the midst of a bruising battle over the cost, provision, or right to basic health care, the kind of face-to-face diagnostic treatment that, quite apart from the million-dollar machines, make it possible to catch some health problems early when they're cheap to treat. These are all aspects of national life that are intimately attached to politics. When and why does a president commit a nation to war? And when war comes, who fights it? Are we in constant danger? And what responses would make sense if we are? Or faced with political problems with a possible military dimension that might respond just as well to something other than war, would we choose not war over war? In my decades in Washington, I've watched politics become an ever more bruising sport with ever more questionable results. It is a problem, a real challenge. It is reality being stood up on its head that now leaves people so suspicious. And I understand why. They're busy doing their lives. They're distracted by the work of getting through the week. And yet, as you heard in an earlier panel, you're also being given the assignment of not taking at face value the work of people whose job it is to pay attention on your behalf. I'll never forget a note I got from a dissatisfied viewer who had a bone to pick with me about the day's events during a Supreme Court confirmation hearing. He wrote, "I saw your report, and it left out what I thought were some key points. So I watched the entire hearing myself." Now, I will grant that my 5-minute report did not, could not capture everything that happened of consequence in those hours of hearings. I did not concede the point that I had purposely left out the things he found interesting in hours of testimony in order to skew impressions one way or another. What is news reporting in the final analysis? It's the exercise of a guy like me who goes to a hearing, watches it all, takes notes, distills events, and boils down 5 hours of events into 5 minutes. Because we assume we are your proxies. We are given the job of being your eyes and ears. Because we've embedded the assumption into our structure that you can't watch 5 hours of hearings. Right? In order to see what really happened, in order to question, critique, reject my version of events, you've got to watch 5 hours of hearings. Something's really wrong. I can't get everything that happened all day into those 5 minutes. And yes, you may disagree with me about some key points in the testimony, but the idea, the very strongly held conviction that I was trying to push people one way or another, to show one conclusion or another through selective editing, shows a new lack of trust that's difficult to get around, corrosive for the public, an existential challenge to the news business, and one that lets politicians off the hook by allowing them the freedom to continue to build their alternative networks, alternative channels for speaking directly to the public without filters, vetting, or critique, and without the essential pushback that forces them to justify, prove, back up some of the things they say. There is a tension between the news business and the political world. It's right there in the long history of the institutions. But right now, elected officials have got the upper hand, especially at a time when truth has become so malleable, so ephemeral, and so heavily shaded by feelings and desirable outcomes. And any politician can go over the news business's head directly to the public. It's a challenge the great repositories of knowledge have got to rise to as well, to make sure the public and the academy has a way to ferret out the truth during an age that, at least for the moment, is having trouble valuing truth very highly. Stay awake. Watch, look, listen. Don't fall for tempting, easy answers. Hold my business to a high standard and make as much use as possible of the highest quality sources to do it. Big, big stuff is going to be decided in the next decade or so, decisions that will have an impact on what America is like when the students that are running around here are actually running the joint. How we feel about it is one thing, what's real is often another, and let's not get them mixed up. Right now, the critical assignment for the news business is rebuilding decades of lost trust. But when one whole side of the great American political divide simply refuses to believe you, it's much harder to rebuild that trust than it sounds. Simply doing what we already do well is part of the answer, but it's not sufficient in and of itself. But it would at least be a start. Thank you very much.
So I've been furiously taking notes. I'm going to read a quote from an article I've been returning to recently, and I'm going to use that to set up my first question to you. American politics has often been an arena for angry minds. In recent years, we've seen angry minds at work, mainly among extreme right-wingers, who have now demonstrated in the Trump movement how much political leverage can be got out of animosities and passions of a small minority. But behind this, I believe there's a style of mind that is far from new, and that is not necessarily right-wing, and I call it the paranoid style simply because no other word adequately evokes the sense of heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy that I have in mind. That is a very resonant quote for me, and it feels right. It feels like it describes the current reality. But as Ray undoubtedly already knows, I lied to you a little bit because the word Trump is not the correct word. The word in the original was Goldwater. And that article was written in 1964 by Richard Hofstadter called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. Now, the reason I'm giving that as my opening quote is I want to ask Ray to comment on the following setup. We could very easily be sitting here talking about the Clinton administration. So it's important to remember that first of all, that Secretary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million votes, Ray's Twitter friend notwithstanding. That absent a politically motivated and ill-timed memo from the newly fired James Comey, that she would likely be president. And we might have had an outcome on November the 8th that all of us would have thought was conventional. However, all of the ugly that Ray describes and all of our concern about anti-intellectualism and the refusal to believe in the veracity of facts when presented by nonpartisan actors would still have been true. So haven't we been missing the boat? Haven't we been lulled into complacency that a 5 million vote win in 2012 and everything's great? A 3 million vote win that results in an electoral college loss in 2016 and the sky is falling. Don't we have to engage anti-intellectualism even when it's not the ascendant?
Yes, it's true that statistically you're correct, and a 3 million vote win that results in a loss should still be recognized for what it represents in the population, except it allowed one particular side of the big American argument to grab all the high ground, seat another justice on the Supreme Court, control the legislative agenda for at least 2, probably 4 years. And basically, the ambitions of the people who took over in January are not small ambitions. They are repealing the New Deal, repealing the Great Society, and repealing the Obama-era liberal consensus. There were large numbers of people in this country who thought that a lot of the big fights were out of the way, as the British say, done and dusted. And they aren't over. And the fact that Trump, who I have always seen as a symptom rather than the disease, is his victory. It may be an accident in some ways, but Trumpism is going to be with us for an awful long time, because the idea that America is going to change fundamentally in the next 25 years, that in some time in the 2040s it's going to become a majority-minority country, the Richard Spencers and others of the world, the Steve Bannons, the Steve Kings, are not ready to concede that idea. They're not ready to let go of the high ground that they have accidentally captured in this last cycle, and they are ready to remake the landscape to the degree possible to prevent that happening.
So let me push a little bit further. You said something a moment ago. You said they all simply refuse to believe facts that we present, no matter how incontrovertible. We had a comment from one of the panelists earlier today who said something similar, like, you know, he lies, they don't care that he lies, I think was how she phrased it. Do we do ourselves a disservice by looking at the white working class that largely drove the outcome of the last election and seeing them as a lost cause, like saying, well, there's nothing we can do to persuade them?
No, I think the way they don't change their minds is tactical, not obstreperous or neurologically deficient. When you read polls that showed that 40% of Republicans still insisted that Barack Obama was a Muslim who was born in a foreign country, do I think they really think that he wasn't born in Hawaii, or that he actually was a Muslim who was drinking beer with a Cambridge cop and not praying 5 times a day and going to church occasionally? They didn't really think that. It was the establishment of an oppositional culture. If you're for something, I'm against it. If you say something's black, I say it's white. If you say something's up, I say it's down, because you and the people like you represent something that I disdain in America. Smarty pants, looking down at me, educated people who have all the answers, think I'm an idiot, and don't respect my way of life. It's just another way of fighting that battle, to give these answers to pollsters. So no, I think it's condescending to see them as a lost cause. They're Americans who, for whom information and the weaponization of information is part of the battle.
So I would agree with you, actually, and I think that I just wanted to hear that from you, because I did sense from some of the panelists today this notion that, well, what's the point of reporting it, because no one's going to pay attention to the fact that, you know, the president's lying or whatever. I think that there is reporting it, and that in political science we have this notion called, social psychology, motivated reasoning, that if you believe someone's a good person, then you suddenly believe everything they have to say, even in the face of mounting evidence. But I do know that it's eventually surmountable, that, you know, for the statisticians in the room, in the Bayesian sense, little by little, the accumulation of additional information will eventually overwhelm that belief. So, for example, the woman, the well-documented, that's kind of a pun in some respects, the well-documented woman in Wisconsin or Indiana whose undocumented spouse was deported after she herself voted for Trump seemed surprised that such a thing occurred. But something tells me she's now figured that part out. But so if the public is ill-informed, I'd like to hear you comment on the intentionality of that. So you very kindly made reference to UCLA and its role as a public research university. Indeed, by most estimations, it is a public Ivy, one of the 5 or 6 most important public research institutions in the world. I think it's important to remember, however, that we should all be reminded that two of the other public Ivies, the University of North Carolina and the University of Wisconsin, are being destroyed through intentional sabotage. That if there is the absence of information, and it's not just the sabotaging of the University of Wisconsin, but it's also the historic defunding of public research institutions over the last 50 years. From a time when states, including this one, paid approximately half the cost of education at the University of California, the University of Iowa, Ohio State, et cetera. They're now paying 11%, 12%, depends on how you count it. That this is actually an intentional attempt to undermine and decertify the creation of science, the creation of facts. And it's not just climate change, it's not just global warming, it's also the Laffer curve nonsense, the notion that reduced tax rates always create this huge, wonderful. There's a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that none of this is true, but it's ideologically inconvenient, so we're going to destroy the messenger.
It is one of the saddest things to watch men and women who in many cases have attended these institutions become conspirators in the destruction of them. It shows a kind of shocking lack of respect for the educations that they themselves left farms or family grocery stores to go get. And you think, well, why did you do it? And I was interviewing the head of the University of Michigan. The public portion of Big Blue's overall funding is now 4%. And they fight constantly, as happens here in California with the legislature. That's just picking sides in a societal battle over the value of knowledge, the value of degrees. Many of the same people who are sending these legislators to Lansing and Sacramento and Des Moines also have children who they are struggling to send to the land-grant universities in their own states. I can't make it out. I just can't make it out.
I'm going to help you, I think, because I think there's an intersection of this economic distress argument.
See, that's me making you sound smart.
Exactly. Which is what I said earlier. So there's an economic distress argument and there's the cultural threat argument. And I think that you and I probably both fall more on the cultural or demographic threat side of the division, but they are potentially connected. And I mentioned this earlier today, and this is not my idea, this belongs to Van Jones, CNN commentator and social activist at one point in time. We were on a panel together during the Democratic National Convention, and during the course of this panel, someone asked him about these rural Midwestern whites who are supporting Trump. And he gave a narrative that was quite funny. It's like, okay, so the factory shut down, and your union middle-class wage job has been replaced with a working-class job, and you scrape together enough money to send your child to the state university anyway, and at Christmas time, he or she comes home and informs you that you're a racist and a homophobe. So I think that this notion of frustration and threat actually is wrapped into the anti-intellectualism.
And I don't know about you, I don't know enough about your family background, but the great fraternity and sorority of first people in your family to go to college is sometimes a very lonely club to be a member of, where your own parents, who usually love you and care about your future and want you to be successful, also feel like they're growing apart from you and alienated from the things that animate you and the concerns you carry into your daily life the more education you get. There is a growing body of literature. I would recommend, there's a wonderful collection of writing by members of that fraternity and sorority called This Fine Place So Far From Home, talking about being the first person in your family to have the privilege of getting higher education. There's a wonderful memoir by a writer named Alfred Lubrano, Lubrano, that takes you into the inner structure of the almost counterintuitive thing of paying for your own kid to become smarter than you are, which, you know, granted, that's the engine. Nobody says, nobody anymore, now that that way of life is under such pressure, says, hey, how about it? It would be great if my kid quit school after the 12th grade and just follows me into the plant where my hours have been cut. I used to get enough overtime to pay for a family vacation and to put away a little money for a nice couple of weeks at the lake or something. Nobody's going to, you know, fewer and fewer American men will say, yes, that is such a secure and desirable life that that's what I want for my children. They are ready to roll the dice on something better being out there because they see the end of their own way of life. There's a wonderful new book about Paul Ryan's hometown, Janesville, Wisconsin, which I recommend to you all. And the reporter from the Washington Post embedded there for 7 years through the closing of the GM plant. And here we had people with kids in college themselves going to get associate's degrees in their mid-40s, scrambling, trying to get something together that will give them a shot at a more secure job than the one they just lost at the Lear plant, which made the seats for the General Motors cars and trucks, and the GM plant itself. So, you know, this is all highly contested terrain because all of these sureties have been swept away by economic change. And that's, I think, very much part of why nobody believes anybody anymore, because everything that they were told when they were teenagers turned out not to be true.
Please convince me of the wisdom of engaging on Fox News and on Twitter. I contextualize this. We have a former colleague, unfortunately, who's passed away, who used to go on Fox News and almost, in a Don Quixote sense, feel like he was tilting against the windmill. We have a political consultant friend who does the same thing. The idea of getting up early to go in on Fox News on a Saturday morning in order to be yelled at just doesn't appeal to me, and so I've repeatedly said no. I wonder why, what's the value in engaging in those things, and what on earth made you reply to a tweet?
Well, those are two separate questions. The invitation, I think it's important for members of the guild, people who are part of this separate, removed from society, secular priesthood, whose folkways are mysterious to regular people, to explain how we do what we do and why we do what we do. And so I thought, you know, if there's 500,000 people watching Fox midday on a Sunday, maybe 50,000 will say, well, he doesn't seem like a nut. And he seems to be, in a very non-histrionic, steady way, explaining why this happens the way it happens. The Times does not rub its hands with glee and say, yes, we're going to run this potentially bombshell story and not name anybody. You know, they would rather have everybody on the record, and I think it's important for people to know that. And so when I was asked to explain it, I went ahead and explained it, thinking, you know, cast your bread on the waters, you know, and I'll see what happens. And responding to a tweet was probably stupid, but I was so intrigued. I was so intrigued by this woman's vehement insistence on a both electoral and popular vote victory that I thought I'd, you know, you see a thread hanging off somebody's garment and you pull on it and you don't realize you're about to unravel their whole sleeve there. I yanked on the thread a little bit. I probably shouldn't have bothered.
You're a better man than I am. Well, I don't know if he can make me look or sound smarter, but I certainly feel smarter after having listened to Ray.
Like a Holiday Inn Express.
Please join me in thanking him.
Thank you.